Okay, our lesson today is on active transport. You've heard about passive transport that included simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion plus osmosis. And so today we're going to talk about the movement of molecules across the cell membrane, but in this case they are going against a concentration gradient.
Okay, what is a cell membrane again?
Well, the cell membrane is a bilipid layer. It has two layers, and this is inside the cell, that's outside the cell, and materials are going to cross this barrier that's around the cell. And so active transport requires energy. That's the main difference between active and passive transport. It requires energy to get this job done. So in this case, we're trying to transport molecules that are going from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. That requires energy. And this diagram right here in the center shows a pump that requires energy in the form of ATP. And so we're going to exchange sodium ions for potassium ions. And the sodium is going out of the cell. There's a lot of sodium out there already, and there's not as much sodium molecules on the inside. So it's going to be going against its gradient. And the potassium the same. There's a lot more inside the cell, but we need the sodium to come into the cell. And so there's going to be a trade. 3 sodiums going out, 2 potassiums coming in, and that requires energy.
So you said that requires ATP. Now where does the cell get the ATP from?
The ATP comes from cellular respiration that you're going to be learning about in the near future. ATP is coming from sugar that goes through a process to make ATP that the cells use as their energy currency.
And what organelle in the cell makes the ATP?
Oh, ATP is made by mitochondria in cells, in eukaryotic cells. And so another part of active transport is by vesicles.
And what are vesicles?
Well, vesicles are spherical membrane-bound organelles that go from the inside to the outside of the cell, or from the outside to the inside of the cell. The first one we're going to talk about is endocytosis.
So endo means into the cell?
Yes, endo means into the cell. So what happens is the membrane, something that's coming into the cell, will form a small vesicle. So the larger molecule is going to be surrounded by part of the membrane. It'll pinch off and come into the cell. And then there's another type called exocytosis.
And I guess exocytosis means coming out of the cell.
Yes, exo means outside. So the vesicle would be delivering something, taking it outside the cell. The vesicle will join with the membrane and expel its contents to the outside of the cell. So endocytosis and exocytosis require energy in order to work. And now Ms. Noble has a little tip from the top about active and passive transport.
Okay, so we talked about active transport and passive transport, and we said passive transport happens naturally, it doesn't need energy. But active transport, just like active people, use energy, active transport uses energy. So I have a way that maybe could help folks remember which one uses energy and which one doesn't.
Great, let's look at it.
Alright, so passive transport is going from an area of high concentration to low concentration usually, right? So you can think of it like there's Miss Noble standing on the top of the hill in her roller skates. Alright, if I start to go down the hill, do I have to use any energy to go down the hill?
No, gravity's pulling you.
Yeah, I don't have to use any energy at all. I'm just going to roll down the hill. Alright, so that's passive transport. From high to low, I don't have to use any energy. I just roll down the hill. And these guys do the same thing. Alright, but active transport can actually transport things against their concentration gradient, or low to high. So if I'm standing at the bottom of that hill and I'm trying to get back up in my roller skates, how much energy do I have to use?
You would need to use a lot of energy.
Yeah, and just like I would need a lot of energy to go from low to high, so do particles moving across a membrane. So active transport is low to high, has to use energy, just like if you were going from an area that's low to an area that's high, you'd have to use a lot of energy.
Thank you.
Here you see a model of the sodium-potassium pump. It uses energy. It's a form of active transport. Study this diagram carefully. It shows movement across the lipid bilayer. The first three diagrams shows passive transport, which requires no extra energy. The second one shows active transport, which does require an input of energy from the cell. This diagram shows a food particle getting engulfed by the cell membrane to make a vesicle. The vesicle then transports into the cell carrying material. This is a form of active transport that requires energy. This diagram shows exocytosis. You can see the vesicle moving out to expel the materials to the outside of the cell. This is a form of active transport that requires energy.